There are two ways to get yourself onto an Ivy League track and field and cross country roster. The first way is without a support slot, and the second way is with a support slot. So let's run down what it looks like to get onto an Ivy roster without a support slot. So if you get into the school on your own, we would call that type of student athlete a walk-on student athlete. Okay. So they haven't gotten any help from the coach to be admitted. They got into the school on their own. And that doesn't mean that they haven't been recruited, though, because some walk-ons have been communicating with the coach for years and they never quite reach the recruiting standards or get to the point where they will get a support slot to help them be admitted. But it kind of doesn't matter whether or not you have a support slot or you don't. If you're admitted and the coach is going to accept you on the team, you find yourself in the same place either way. Whether the walk-on student athlete has been communicating with that coach, has gone on campus tours, has met the team, or sometimes the student athlete is accepted into the university and then contacts the coach afterward. That happens. Those are the best thing ever for the coach because the coach did no work in the recruiting process. An athlete reaches out to them and says, "Hey, I want to be on the team." And sometimes that walk on is really good. Like they can be very close to the recruiting standards. And oftentimes they've met the recruiting standards because keep in mind, recruiting standards are typically looking at the junior year because you're not going to get to see the senior year marks before you're making your college decision if you're going to the Ivy League because the Ivy League operates early on an early timeline that happens in the first semester. So cross country will happen in the fall of the senior year. Those marks will be seen before early decision, but you won't get to see the senior year track marks. So a lot of recruiting standards are based around the junior year marks. Let's say you don't hit those recruiting standards your junior year. So you don't have the chance to get a recruiting slot, but you may be accepted to a college on your own. And if it's an Ivy League college, you got accepted on your own. And then maybe your senior year, you exceed recruiting standards. And now you're at this Ivy League school. You reach out to the Ivy League coach and say, "Hey, I'd love to be on the team." They're going to be overjoyed because they didn't have to use a recruiting slot on you and you're a competitive Division I student athlete. So walk-ons can either be recruited or they can just get in on their own and then join the team. Typically, if you reach out to a coach and say, "Hey, I want to get onto the team, I want to walk onto the team." In the Ivy League, coaches are supposed to give you a tryout. That doesn't mean they're always going to give you a tryout. People break rules all the time, but they're supposed to give you a tryout. So they'll often give you a 2-week trial period. And if you meet their standards, whatever those are, you want to ask up front, "What do I need to do to make this team?" Then you'll make the team. And if you don't live up to their standards, then you may not. Sometimes there are roster limits that the coach will tell you, "Sorry, I don't have any more space on my roster." And in that case, you might be out of luck and you can't walk onto that team. But what you can always ask as a follow-up question would be, "Well, is there any way that I can show that I would be more valuable than anyone on your roster?" And they'll often tell you, "Well, you can train on your own and you can come compete at our home meet. And if you beat some of the athletes on the team, then you may have a chance to walk onto the team." And nothing is guaranteed, but it's just general sense of this is how the process might go for you. Now, every coach is going to help guide you through that process. They may say, "Forget it, we're not taking anybody else," or they may give you all the good information about how you could make the team and what you would need to do to make the team. Some pretty hardcore coaches will actually have a tryout for their entire team every year. In this case, they might tell you as the athlete who's trying to walk on, "We're having a tryout for the whole team." So the whole team is going to run, usually it's for an event group. So let's say it's the distance event group. The whole team is going to run a workout, and those who run it best are going to make the team. And it's possible that that'll be the case. So they may incorporate walk-ons and also the entire group of athletes who are already on the roster into a tryout. And if you compete up to a certain standard, then that may be a way to find yourself onto a team. So what would it look like in comparison to getting onto a team without the recruiting slot? What does it look like to get onto a team with a recruiting slot? If you meet a certain standard and the coach decides that they want you on their team, they can use that recruiting slot on you to increase your chances of being admitted. Usually, this means that the student athlete has met the recruiting standards or exceeded the recruiting standards, but not always. And so, how might you get onto a roster while falling short of the recruiting standards of that university? There are a few different ways. The first thing would be is if you have incredibly high, what we call academic index. We're going to go into great depth on what the academic index is, but all you really need to know now is if you're an exceptionally good student with exceptionally good grades and test scores that are far exceeding the average of the team, you may be very valuable from an academic perspective to one of these top tier institutions like an Ivy League school. So that's one way. These are not cut and dry processes. So the recruiting standards are the standards that the coaches want you to be at for them to recruit you. But if their recruiting season doesn't go as planned, and maybe they have 10 recruits that meet the recruiting standards, but maybe all 10 of those go to other schools. They decide not to come to that university. So you might fall short of the recruiting standards and be 10th or 11th on their depth chart. But with all 10 of their top athletes deciding to go elsewhere, now you're at the top of their depth chart and now you're in the mix. So here's another way that you might find yourself on an Ivy League roster while failing to meet the recruiting standards of that university. Imagine you are the jumps coach at Cornell, okay? And you have a certain number of recruiting slots. And usually the way that works is the athletic administration of the university determines how many recruiting slots each team is going to get, each sport is going to get. So let's say they determine that the women's Cornell track and field team is going to get 20 slots. That's just a guess, but that's pretty good guess and might be spot on given, what we know about the number of people they bring in on their roster year to year. So then the head coach determines how the slots should be allocated to each of the event groups. And my guess, a fair guess would be 4 throwers, 4 jumpers, 6 sprinters, 6 distance runners. So if you're the jumps coach, your head coach is telling you you can have about 4. So let's say I'm the jumps coach and I get my first, I get my second, I get my third, I get my fourth choices. They all come. I fill up all my slots. I'm done with recruiting for the season. And then all of a sudden, the distance coach decides to leave and take another job or get out of coaching entirely, whatever. So now all of a sudden, 6 additional slots are just tossed up in the air because a lot of those recruits who the distance coach was recruiting are not actually going to want to come because there's no coach at Cornell and they don't want to make a commitment to Cornell because they don't know who the coach is going to be. So maybe somebody from the staff continues recruiting distance runners and they get 1 or 2 or 3 of them, but there's still going to be multiple other slots that are available. If you're in the mix with that jumps coach, you're talking to that jumps coach, they may tell you, sorry, we're out of slots, but then all of a sudden slots might appear because a coach leaves. So now if you're the next one in line for that coach, they may reach out to you and say, hey, I got a slot. Do you want it? And sometimes it can happen real quick. You got to be ready to say yes or no, or ask for a little more time. But in any case, you want to keep your options open with as many schools that you're interested in as possible. So you give yourself the best chance of landing one of these bonus slots that kind of seem like they pop into thin air when things don't go to plan for these track and field and cross country staffs. So, if you only want to go to Cornell and you don't meet the recruiting standards, then you better be a great student and know you're going to get in. Your best bet is to, broaden your horizons and say, well, I'm interested in any of the Ivy League schools, or I'm interested in these Ivy League schools and these NESCAC schools, or these Ivy League schools plus Duke and Stanford and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt doesn't have a men's team, but Vanderbilt if you're on the women's side. But it's important to broaden your horizons and keep your options open, especially if you fall below a lot of the recruiting standards at the universities you want to go to, so that you give yourself the best chance of getting one of these slots if they do open up. Because sometimes you can't even foresee that they're going to open and then it opens and you got to be ready. So we covered a few different ways that you might be able to get a recruiting slot despite not living up to the recruiting standards of a university. And each one of these things you have some control over, but some of them you have no control over, right? Like whether or not extra slots open up, you don't have any control over that. You just need to be ready when the opportunity arises. But having an exceptionally high academic index or being an incredibly good student, that's one you have some control over. But some people are not going to be the 1600 SAT person, no matter how hard they try. And some people aren't going to be 4.0 students, no matter how hard they try. So while you have some control over that, you also don't have full control over that. Now, one thing that you have that this is like kind of the secret sauce, and I know it's going to be kind of boring when I tell you what the secret sauce is. It's very obvious, but it is making yourself more valuable to that coach by being the kind of athlete that they want on their team. And so this is like having an attitude that the coach specifically wants on their team. This can help leapfrog you above student athletes who have better athletic performances than you, because at the end of the day, what the coach wants is great collegiate athletes who are going to make their team better. What they don't want is great high school athletes who don't transition well to college, or great high school athletes who have bad attitudes and are going to drag their team down. They want team performance. And so there are some intangibles that are not specifically related to athletic ability that might make them think that you're going to improve the performance of the team. And so having a great attitude, and we're going to cover a lot about communicating with coaches a little bit further along in this section, but that can't be understated how important that is. And that is definitely a way that you can increase your chances of getting a support slot while falling below the recruiting standards of that school.